On the morning of August 12, 1969, a letter arrived at a house in Venice, California. No one opened it that day. By the time anyone did, it wouldn't matter anymore. Inside was a photograph, cut carefully from a magazine, of a man's face. Drawn over it, in pencil, was the outline of a gun, pointed at his head. Beneath it, 2 words. High noon. That morning, the man in the photograph left for work like he had every day for years. He didn't know about the letter. He didn't know it would arrive on the exact day, and somewhere close to the exact hour, that someone had been planning to kill him. We're going to tell you who wrote those words, and why. But to understand what high noon meant, you have to go back 14 years before it was ever written. To a Christmas Eve. To 4 sisters who didn't yet know that somewhere in their audience, someone was already watching a little too closely. Christmas Eve, 1955. Millions of American families gathered around their televisions for a holiday broadcast of the Lawrence Welk Show, a program built on big band orchestras, ballroom dancing, and the kind of wholesome, champagne bubble entertainment that defined post-war television. That night, 4 sisters from a working-class Catholic family in Venice, California, walked out under the studio lights for the first time. Diane was 15. Peggy was 14. Kathy was 12. Janet was 9. They sang. And something about them, the close, blood harmony of sisters who'd grown up singing together in church pews and crowded kitchens, stopped the country cold. Within weeks, the Lennon sisters weren't just guests on the show. They were fixtures. Welk treated them, by his own description, like his own daughters. And America treated them like something even bigger. Living proof that wholesomeness still existed, even as the culture around them was about to change in ways nobody could yet predict. By the early 1960s, the Lennon sisters were one of the most photographed families in America, covered, by some measures, second only to Jacqueline Kennedy and Elizabeth Taylor. Fan mail arrived by the sack. Teen magazines ran their faces on covers next to headlines asking which sister was America's favorite. They appeared at countless arenas, charity events, presidential functions. They would eventually entertain 7 sitting presidents. But fame in that era didn't come with the infrastructure we'd recognize today. There was no security detail screening the mail. No formal process for flagging the letters that felt different from the rest. Fan mail was fan mail, sorted by volunteers, mostly unread by the family themselves, filed away or thrown out. Which meant that somewhere in those sacks of letters, for years, a different kind of voice was writing in. And no one was reading closely enough to notice. To understand what was at stake, it helps to understand who the Lennons actually were, off the sound stage. They were one of 11 children, raised by William and Isabel Lennon in a 2-bedroom house in Venice, California, modest, devout, and full. The family attended Mass together at the Church of St. Mark. Faith wasn't an aesthetic for the Lennons, it was the architecture of the household. William Lennon, Bill, had worked for years as a milkman before taking a job as a golf instructor at a course in Marina del Rey. He wasn't a stage father in the way the era sometimes produced. By most accounts, he was protective, steady, and proud of his daughters without trying to control or commercialize them beyond what the show itself required. Isabel ran the household of 11 with what her daughters would later describe as quiet, formidable strength. Between Bill's golf course wages and the income from the show, the family built a life that was comfortable but never extravagant, for famous daughters going home, most nights, to the same crowded, ordinary house where they'd grown up. That contrast, astonishing fame, ordinary home, is part of what made the Lennon sisters so beloved. It's also, in a darker sense, part of what made them vulnerable. Their visibility scaled far faster than any system built to protect them. By 1969, the sisters had spent 13 years on the Lawrence Welk Show, nearly their entire adolescence and young adulthood lived in front of a camera. They were preparing for what looked like the next big step, their own television program, produced alongside comedian Jimmy Durante, set to premiere that fall. It should have been the high point of everything they'd built. It became, instead, the year everything they built nearly collapsed. Not because of anything the sisters did, but because of someone they had never met, who believed he already knew them better than anyone alive. His name was Chet Young. What's known about him paints the picture of a man unraveling long before anyone in the Lennon family ever heard his name. He had a documented history of psychiatric institutionalization and multiple hospitalizations tied to delusional thinking. And at some point, his delusions fixed on a single, specific belief that he was married to Peggy Lennon. Not infatuated with her. Not a fan in any conventional sense. In his mind, the marriage was already real. Settled. The only obstacle standing between him and the life he believed he was owed was one man, Peggy's father, Bill Lennon. For years, accounts suggest as many as 5, Young had been writing to the family. Stalking them. In the sense that word carries today, though the word itself barely existed yet as a matter of public understanding, let alone law enforcement protocol. There was no restraining order system built for this kind of threat. No formal channel for a famous family receiving thousands of letters to identify the one voice that was different from the rest, fixated, possessive, escalating. The letters didn't stop because Young was institutionalized once, or even multiple times. Mental health holds in that era were often short, under-resourced, and disconnected from any system that tracked a person's risk to specific individuals once they were released. He would be hospitalized. He would be released. And the letters, eventually, would resume. None of this reached the sisters in any way that registered as a 5-alarm threat, not because the family was careless, but because the entire concept of an obsessive fan as a lethal threat hadn't yet entered the public imagination. That understanding wouldn't fully arrive in American culture for another 2 decades, after another young actress, in another decade, was killed on her own doorstep by a man who'd been writing to her for years. In the summer of 1969, in Los Angeles, that understanding didn't exist yet. What existed was a man named Chet Young, increasingly convinced that the only thing standing between him and the wife he believed he had was a 53-year-old golf instructor from Venice. August 12, 1969. 6 weeks before the Lennon sisters' new show was set to premiere. Just days after the Tate LaBianca murders had plunged Los Angeles into a citywide state of dread, a coincidence of timing that would make what happened next feel, to a frightened public, like part of some larger unraveling. Bill Lennon arrived at the Venice golf course in Marina del Rey for an ordinary day of work. Just after noon, as he crossed the parking lot, a man stepped out from behind a parked car. Witnesses would later say the two men appeared to know each other, that words were exchanged, that there was a brief struggle over a weapon. Bill Lennon was heard shouting for help, trying to break away. He didn't make it. He was shot once. He managed to run toward a corner of the lot before he collapsed. The man who shot him fled the scene in a car and vanished. Why the next morning, it was front-page news across the country. Father of the Lennon sisters shot to death. In a city already reeling from the Manson murders just days earlier, the killing of a beloved television family's patriarch landed like a second, smaller earthquake, proof, to a frightened public, that nowhere and no one was safe. Within about a week, investigators had identified a suspect, a man who had been sending threatening, disturbed letters to the family for months, possibly years. His name went out to police across the state. And then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he disappeared, fleeing into the Sierra Nevada mountains, evading a manhunt that stretched on for weeks with no resolution. The Lennon family was placed under 24-hour police protection. The sisters, several of them already married, with children of their own, moved back into their mother's house, the only address with round-the-clock security. They couldn't all be protected separately. They could only be protected together. And they still had a television show to finish. Jimmy Durante Presents The Lennon Sisters Hour was supposed to be a triumphant new chapter. Instead, it became something the sisters had to survive in public while grieving in private. They kept their contractual obligations. They taped the remaining episodes, but on a closed set, without a studio audience, surrounded by an unprecedented level of security for a variety show. The grief was inescapable, and so, now, was the fear. Every stage door, every crowd, every piece of unscreened mail now carried a different weight. For weeks, the man who killed their father remained at large. Somewhere in the mountains, or perhaps somewhere far closer, no one could say for certain. The not knowing whether he was finished, or whether the threat was ongoing, may have been its own form of torment, led on top of a loss the sisters hadn't had a single private moment to process. 2 months after the murder, the search ended. Though not with an arrest. Chet Young was found dead inside the trunk of an abandoned car, having taken his own life with the same weapon he'd used against Bill Lennon. Around him, investigators found stacks of Lennon's sisters' fan magazines. And among his belongings, a written confession, one that showed, by every account, absolutely no remorse. He described the killing as justified. In his mind, to the very end, he had simply removed an obstacle between himself and a marriage that had never existed anywhere but in his own head. The case was closed. But for the Lennon family, nothing about it felt finished. Jimmy Durante Presents The Lennon Sisters Hour lasted only 1 season. Critics at the time chalked it up to an awkward pairing between Durante's old-school comedy and the sisters' style. But it's hard, in hindsight, to separate a struggling show from a cast that had just lived through a national tragedy in real time, on camera, without ever being allowed to stop and grieve. When the Durante show ended, it would have been easy for the Lennon sisters' career to end with it. Instead, another entertainer stepped in. Andy Williams invited the sisters to join his own show as regulars and to tour with him extensively in the years that followed. By the family's own account, Williams told them plainly they couldn't let one man's actions define or end their lives. It was, in its own way, an early and instinctive form of what we'd now recognize as trauma-informed support. Built not on clinical language, but on simple loyalty. The sisters kept singing. Through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, they toured, recorded more than 20 albums, and eventually settled into a long, beloved residency in Branson, Missouri, that spanned decades. They were inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 2001. They received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. What's perhaps most remarkable is what the sisters themselves have said, across decades of interviews, about what carried them through. Not vengeance. Not bitterness. Their mother's strength. Each other. And a refusal, deliberate, sustained, and lifelong, to let what happened in that parking lot in 1969 become the only story anyone remembered about them. Today, all four original sisters are still alive, still close, by their own description, best friends as much as siblings. The trio configuration that continued performing into recent years carried the family's harmony forward into a 5th and 6th decade, a kind of quiet, ongoing rebuttal to a man who once believed he could end their story by ending their father's. The letter that arrived at the Lennon house on August 12, 1969, was never meant to be a warning. By the time anyone opened it, it had already become something else entirely. The only confession its author would ever leave behind in his own hand, written in advance, for a crime that the world would spend the next half-century trying to understand. High noon came and went that day, in a sunlit parking lot, in front of witnesses who never saw it coming. The sisters did the only thing they knew how to do afterward. They kept singing.
With a smile that makes my temperature